What's up guys, Kyle here again, and today we're gonna shoot out the PRS Archon 50 with the MT15. Let's do it. All right, hope you guys are doing great out there today. We're taking a look at the PRS Archon 50 versus the MT15. A lot of people have asked me to do this video because they were curious how the MT15 stacked up against the bigger, much more expensive Archon 50. So in the clip that you guys just heard, the Archon 50 sounds smoother and midier, but not as aggressive. It doesn't seem quite as saturated in the same way either. Whereas the MT15 seems to have a little bit more saturation, more like a 5150 style amp. To me, the MT15 reminds me a little bit more of a 5150, whereas the Archon reminds me a little bit more of a dual rectifier. This one seems to have a little bit more rounded mids, whereas the mids on the MT15 seem to be a little bit more pointed and a little bit more aggressive in the upper mid area. So other than that, there's not a huge amount of difference in the sound, honestly. They're fairly close, and I bet you that we can dial them to sound really close to each other. So that's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna go ahead and put everything at noon on both the gain channels on these amps, turn my boost off. I had the Deadweald Duality on in the beginning. Both amps were boosted. We're both going through the same cab, same speaker with my Tonebone amp switcher here. So you're getting an apples to apples comparison of each head through the same cab, same mic, everything, even same speaker. So let's turn the boost off. Let's put everything to noon as far as the EQs and presence are concerned, and the gain at 9 o'clock on both amps. I had the bright switch on the Archon, and I'm gonna leave it that way. The Archon also has a depth pot that the MT15 does not have. So keep that in mind. There's a little bit more adjustability, and the bright switch. Yeah, the gain is at 9 o'clock on both amps. So we are gonna start on the Archon 50, and then we're gonna go over to the MT15 to see how they compare directly with everything at noon and gains at 9 o'clock on their gain channels. Real quick before we dive into that, if this is you guys' first time here at my channel, what I do is I take awesome high gain amps such as these, and I play through them or I shoot them out. And then I give you guys the raw, unprocessed audio from my SM57 directly into my interface. There is no post-processing. I don't do anything before I export it. So you guys are getting a very clean, clear picture of exactly what is going on here. So if you're into high gain tones like that, I would really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button on your way out after this video is over and consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. All right, so we are on the Archon 50. Let's hear how that sounds. All right, so as you can hear with everything at noon, the Archon 50 is a little bit brighter, a little bit livelier, and the MT15 seems to have like a little bit of a blanket over the speakers effect going on. So let's pull the presence up on the MT15 a little bit and compensate for that. Overall, I would say the Archon 50 is still brighter with everything at noon, even after we dial some presence on the MT15. And surprisingly, the MT15 seems to have just a beefier low end. It sounds fuller, and it's definitely punchier than the Archon 50 is. Okay, so let's add a little bit of depth in the power amp on the Archon and see if that kind of makes up for that gap. All right, so it's a little bit more even now. I think I can actually roll the Archon 50 depth back a little bit. Let's pull the gain up on the MT15. Seems like the Archon 50 has a little bit more gain at that spot on the pot than it does on the MT15. So bump it up just a little bit. Both amps have way more than enough gain on their gain channels to get into high gain territory very, very quickly. So I would not worry about either not having enough gain for your application. I think both are gonna have way more than enough. Man, that MT15 just has such a nice low end punch to it. I really kind of generally prefer this amp over the Archon 50 just because it seems a little bit more aggressive and it seems like it sounds bigger even though it's a smaller form factor, smaller power section amp. It's kind of surprising. So let's get a little bit of mids and treble going on the MT15. We'll leave the bass where it's at. We'll leave the Archon 50 where it's at. So yeah, overall, I still feel like there's just not as much upper mid aggression on the MT15. Let's add some treble and some mids and a little bit of gain. MT15 still just has this nice growl to it, whereas the Archon's very smooth. Let's see if we can change that with the presence on the Archon a little bit. Okay, so now we're kind of we're going back and forth. It's like as soon as I make one a little bit brighter, it's the differences are very subtle between the two. Other than the Archon 50 actually has a lot more mids, it seems like. So let's dial the mids up on the MT15. Yeah, it seems like the Archon 50 just has more overall mid bark to it for sure. So let's actually roll the mids back a little bit. And as you can tell, that low end difference is still there on the MT50. It's still bigger and punchier. All right, let's get a little bit more presence on the Archon. The way we have them dialed, they're almost damn near identical at this point. A little bit more presence on the MT15. Man, they're so close, it's crazy. Again, there just seems to be a little bit more like upper mid presence on the MT15 that doesn't quite exist in this amp the way that no matter what way you dial it. Let's hit it with a boost out front and see how differently each amp reacts to the boost because we had them almost the same before the boost came on. The differences are a little bit more pronounced with the boost on. I would say the upper mid presence on the MT15 becomes even more apparent once you kick that boost on out in front for whatever reason. Whereas the Archon 50 still just kind of retains that same smoothness but tightens up and obviously gets some saturation from the boost. All right, let's add some treble to the Archon and see if we can kind of get it to have a little bit more aggression overall because it just seems to be lacking that upper mid bite that I really like about the MT15. You guys may feel differently. You guys may like the smoothness of the Archon and that's okay. But me personally, I just like where the MT15 EQ sits a little bit better. So the treble adds a lot of brightness, but it doesn't necessarily add it in a way that's pleasant. There also seems to be a little bit more clarity in the MT15, which is kind of surprising as well. All right, so again, I'm just enjoying this one a little bit more. Let's pump the mids and the presence on the Archon, and maybe a little bit more bass too to kind of fatten it up. And pull those trebles back a little bit. The trebles. All right, let's add a little bit more presence on the MT15. Now, honestly, even though this one kind of has a little bit more upper mid brightness, I almost feel like this one will sit better in a mix with where the mids are placed, but I'm trying super hard to dial them close to each other, just close to the tone that I would want. And every time I think I have it, I switch back and forth, and there's still differences that I'm noticing, so. All right. Also, the Archon 50 is very quiet, and so is the MT15. So I'm almost feeling like I need to eat my words at the beginning of this video, because it seems like, although the mids still are rounder in the Archon, they are not as low mid bass, whereas the MT15 seems to have a little bit more low mid emphasis. Whereas this is kind of more like a 5150 in the mids. It almost has that cocktois mid sound going on the way that I have it dialed right now. If we dial them up a little bit more, I bet you it'll be even closer to that kind of 5150 style. Blech, I keep burping. The 5150 style mids. Yeah, there's just a lot more mids. You're gonna perceive a volume difference, especially with these two mics, just because how much more mids the Archon 50 seems to have. Now, if I kind of almost dime them on the MT15, which I tend to play with them pretty high anyways for my style, let's see the difference in the mids. They're definitely there, but it's just not as round. It's not as vocal. It's more of a pointed upper mid, almost right below the highs. Whereas the Archon 50 is kind of like a, just more that cocktois mid thing. The mids are a little bit more broad, but. I would say, honestly, I'm kind of surprised at the lack of low end that I'm getting out of the Archon 50 right now. This one just seems to have more like sub-lows, I guess. It just feels bigger in the room, which is kind of surprising because you'd think with the bigger power section and the added depth control that the Archon 50 would feel bigger. Let's dime the depth control and see if that makes a big difference. Honestly, with the depth control dime, that feels very similar to how the MT15 is. Obviously, there's no way to adjust the resonance or the depth on that amp, so it's almost like it's full out on the Archon. In my opinion, both amps sound great. They're just a little bit off of each other. If you heard them both in a band mix, I feel like you would probably be hard-pressed to find the difference between the two. I still feel that the MT15 has the punchier, kind of nastier low end. I just like it a little bit better. It doesn't seem to have quite the same kick on the 50 as the MT15 does. I don't know, it's kind of crazy to me. I'm finding myself preferring the MT15 pretty much full stop. Let's go down to drop D real quick. Again, I just feel like the differences are pretty much there no matter what. Let me scoop the mids out on both amps and see how different they sound. Kind of the same difference between both of them. That's a little bit surprising. It had almost the exact same effect. Now the mids are both set at about 6 out of 10. And again, the Archon just seems to have way more mids than the MT15 does. So it really comes down to your personal preference. I mean, this amp is definitely bigger. It's definitely heavier. It's a lot more expensive. You can find these for $500 to $600 used. You can find these for like 1,000 used. The prices on them have gone through the roof recently. So if it were up to me, obviously you are going to get more headroom through this because it's going to have the bigger power section. But overall, I've played shows with the MT15 before, and it's enough. It's enough, especially if you're getting mic'd and you really don't have to push it. It's definitely enough for live shows, and it sounds great. Doesn't really compress all that much, even if you're really pushing it. So that would be my choice, but I'll play one more riff real quick, and then we'll get out of here. All right, guys, that's gonna do it for me today. What did you guys think about the differences between the two amps? What did you hear on the other end of this audio that I didn't hear in the room? I'm really curious to see how you guys think that they stacked up. We've got both amps going through the same exact speaker with the same mic placement. We're just switching back and forth between the heads and into the same cab. So yeah, I'm really curious to see what you guys think about the difference between these two amps. I know I personally prefer the MT15 a little bit due to the upper mid aggression, and it's got a little bit more liquid feeling saturation, but overall I'd be happy to play either of these amps live. So let me know what your guys' thoughts are down in the comments. Again, if you like this video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Down in the description of the video are all my support links, including my Patreon, my DistroKid VIP link where you sign up to get 7% off and I get a kickback, all my Amazon affiliate stuff, my Facebook page, everything is down there, so I'd appreciate it if you guys take a second to go down there. Take a look at the stuff in the description. Thanks again, guys. Kyle here again, and we'll see you next time.